Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vittorian, and this is the 25th hour, helping you remember everything that happened beyond the 24/7 news cycle. Now, in this week's news for the week of April 25th to May 1st, 2021, de Blasio pledged to make the city fully reopen by July 1st. Comptroller Scott Stringer has been hit by a sexual assault allegation, putting pressure on him to drop out of the mayor's race. Councilman Chaim Deutsch has been kicked out of the council for tax fraud. Governor Cuomo lamented about how unfair his scandals have been on him while announcing a series of job openings. Biden gave his first address to Congress pitching his American jobs and family plans, and vaccinated people don't have to worry about wearing masks outside. Now, on to the show. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Starting with de Blasio. The mayor announced this week that the city plans to be fully reopened starting July 1st with no more restrictions on businesses, restaurants, and retail stores. De Blasio also said he wasn't concerned about what the governor was going to say about his announcement, saying the state government always has something to say.
This summer, this is going to be the summer of New York City. We're all going to get to enjoy this city again, and people are going to flock here from all over the country to be a part of this amazing moment in New York City. It means going to stores, and anyone who wants to shop at a store can go to a store again. It means bars and restaurants being able to come back, bring back so many of their employees, serve so many more customers. It means so many of our cultural events being open again, theaters coming back, so many of the things that we cherish. And what it means for everyday working people, for all those cooks and waiters and bartenders and folks who work in the kitchen, for the small business owners, the folks who built up their businesses for years and years and have fought to survive, for everyday people, for our artists and our performers, it means a chance to do what you are so great at again, and a chance to bring joy to so many other New Yorkers. So this is going to be an amazing summer. And I can't tell you, I am so excited. I don't have words to say it enough.
The Broadway League said that it would try to have shows up and running by September with a May 11th announcement scheduled for the return of some shows in the meantime. De Blasio said that 9,500 city employees are going to be paid back their week-long furlough that took place between October and March when the city went through a budget crisis applying to managers, non-union jobs, and city hall staffers. The city spent more than $200 million to retrofit office buildings to comply with COVID safety requirements as it prepares for the return of 80,000 city workers. The city has also hit a 3.5% 7-day rolling positivity rate average, the lowest since November, showing progress in the city's fight against the pandemic. But although the positivity rates are low, City Health Commissioner Dave Chokshi said that 5% of city residents missed their second vaccine appointments. An investigation by the city comptroller's office found that the city overpaid $8.26 million for ventilators that were never delivered in the height of the pandemic. The city sued Global, the firm that was supposed to deliver the ventilators this past October, but only got back $6.4 million. Mayor de Blasio didn't pass up his chance to roast Cuomo again this week, saying the governor is living a life of illusion because of the way he's denying his sexual assault and nursing home allegations leveled against him. De Blasio also railed against Cuomo after the census results were released, showing the state was losing a seat in the House of Representatives due to an 89% loss in the population.
I'm trying to remember the lyric from the song. Is it living a life of illusion or living a life of delusion? I can't remember exactly what it was, but that's what we're seeing here. I mean, this, it's clear with the fact that there was a cover-up of the nursing home scandal is documented. His top aide said it in front of a group of legislators. We have numerous women who have come forward and talk about sexual assault and harassment. I mean, these things are documented. So I don't understand how he's saying that. I think the investigations will proceed, and I absolutely assume the investigations will prove, in fact, something very wrong happened.
A study released by the Coalition for the Homeless found that the number of single adults living in homeless shelters has reached the record high of 20,822 on average every night this past February, with the death rate for that population from COVID 54% higher than the citywide average. The mayor also released his executive budget proposal for this year, coming out $98.6 billion, $10 billion more than the last one. It includes measures such as 3K for all, increased funding for vaccinations, and education funding. $500 million will be earmarked for testing and tutoring, universal academic assessments to see how far students have fallen behind due to the pandemic, and more time for teachers to plan for their classes. $4 million of the budget is allocated for open streets, the practice of closing off entire roads from cars in order to create pedestrian plazas and zones, and $8.5 million for restaurants to be able to expand their outdoor eating spaces. What is sure to piss off drivers, de Blasio's budget includes $46 million to expand the number of speed cameras throughout the 5 boroughs by 360 for a total of 2,200 cameras. Eric Adams was endorsed this week by Bronx's borough president Ruben Diaz Jr., hoping to give Yang a run for his money, and was also endorsed by the TW Local 100, the MTA labor union. Former de Blasio council Maya Wiley got an endorsement from Amplify Her, a group focusing on electing women to office. Yang got the endorsement of the Jewish Hasidic vote with a coalition of congregations called Borough Park United, including Bobov, Belz, Satmar, Sands, Klausenberg, and Pupa, taking full-page ads in Jewish neighborhoods professing their support for Yang. Former Sanitation Commissioner Catherine Garcia, despite having the bureaucratic experience and a get-it-done campaign attitude, is still polling in the single digits and has increasingly become a popular candidate for everyone's second choice on their ranked choice voting ballots, according to Politico. A more recent poll by Politico found that Eric Adams is closing the gap between himself and Andrew Yang, with Adams receiving 20% in the first round of ranked choice voting against Yang's 26%. Eric Adams started stressing public safety as a main pillar of his campaign, accusing his fellow candidates of not putting out sufficient plans to reverse the increased gun violence in the city and hitting them on plans to defund the police. Adams was a former police officer himself and even said that he would shed his personal security detail in favor of a gun that he would just carry himself. Adams said that his background as a former cop isn't a concern for black New Yorkers, saying that they're more concerned about crime. Consequently, Adams said that he would bring back a disbanded anti-crime unit that de Blasio got rid of because of controversy over how the plainclothes unit treated suspects, targeted minorities, and lied about criminal allegations. Adams addressed those concerns by saying the anti-crime unit he wants to bring back would be reformed to allay the concerns of the community. Adams also announced that he plans to appoint a local special prosecutor that would focus on getting illegal guns off the streets and continue to push back against defunding the police. The Brooklyn Borough president also took a page out of West Virginia Governor Jim Justice's playbook by pitching to pay any unvaccinated New Yorkers by the time he's mayor $100 to get their shots. Comptroller Scott Stringer was accused of sexual assault this week from Gene Kim, a former lobbyist and a former intern who worked on Stringer's 2001 campaign for comptroller. Kim's lawyer mentioned groping and propositioning in exchange for a district leader position, but Stringer denied any wrongdoing, denied Kim was just an intern, and also reserved further comment until more of the story came out. Stringer then said later in the week that he and Kim had what he believed to be a consensual relationship that was on and off.
I categorically deny that in any way I did anything without her consent. We were friends for a very long time. It turned into something more for a brief time. And it was just totally consensual. We met 20 years ago. You're right, she was a volunteer, as many of my friends were volunteers. She was not an intern, as they claimed yesterday. She didn't work for me. She wanted to be hired by me in 2013, 12 years later, in the campaign for controller. She submitted her resume, and we couldn't hire her. She then went to work for Elliot Spitzer, my rival in the campaign. But I'm just saying today that I do respect Jean's right to come forward and say what's on her mind and give her space to do that. I think that's very critical and important. I really believe in that. But I also am here today to absolutely refute those charges.
More specifically, I'm looking to see what was the extent of your relationship then. Jean Kim said yesterday, she told Arcady Corrado that there was never a romantic relationship. You're saying otherwise.
There was a relationship, yes.
Stringer's progressive allies who had earlier endorsed him took back their approval for his campaign, and he refuses to drop out of the race. It was later reported that Kim was involved in petitioning for Andrew Yang, spurring accusations of political bias from Stringer's remaining allies, but Kim denied working on Yang's campaign. Mayor de Blasio called for an independent investigation of the allegations, but wasn't sure if the Department of Investigations or the State Attorney General would lead the probe. Yang released a policy proposal for the city's park system, restoring the park's budget to pre-pandemic levels, and would allow the Parks Department to keep money it earns from selling concessions. Yang also called out Knicks owner James Dolan, calling on him to relinquish ownership of the team. Yang and Citigroup executive Ray McGuire got into a brief heated moment at a Mets Council forum when Yang said that the city should start paying for the subways, which is a creature of the state. McGuire retorted at Yang, saying that the city can't afford it. Yang also released an affordable housing policy proposal this week seeking to spend $32 billion to create and maintain 250,000 units in 8 years, spending $4 billion annually on the plan. The New York Times reported that most New Yorkers are still remaining pretty clueless about the mayor's race 2 months away from the June primary. 33% of registered voters said they were certain they were voting in the primary, according to a New York One and Ipsos poll. 1 in 4 unregistered voters said they're planning on registering in time. The saga behind Sean Donovan's father, Michael Donovan, raising millions of dollars for a political action committee supporting Sean's mayoral run continues, as the senior Donovan admitted in an affidavit to the campaign finance board that he discussed potential donors with Sean's campaign finance director. Although it's not a de facto violation of campaign finance rules, because political action committees are the ones not allowed to coordinate with campaigns, other mayoral candidates say Donovan's campaign violated the spirit of the law. The city is going to launch a $15 million campaign to educate voters about ranked choice voting ahead of the June Democratic mayoral primary, which includes TV, radio, print, and digital advertising. 51,000 students officially went back to school in person after their families were given the choice by the Department of Education, although a majority of public school students, or 61%, are still remaining remote. Parents are still crying foul, however, upon only discovering their kids doing Zoom classes anyway just inside their school classes, since some teachers are still working from home. The city expanded mental health screenings on all public school students, covering every student after initially only covering the 27 hardest hit communities. De Blasio announced that 500 more social workers would be added to schools next fall, aiming to help families get through the trauma caused by the pandemic's disruption to normal routines. Specialized high schools admitted an even lower amount of minority students this year, with Black and Latino 8th graders making up 9% of the specialized school population, down from 11%. The low marks on diversity launched a protest against the SHSAT, which activists say is a barrier from granting minority students full access to specialized high schools, while Asian parents in particular combat that assertion, being members of the minority community themselves. Chancellor Misha Ross Porter called for the end of the SHSAT after the data was released. The New York Times reported about how guards in the corrections department often lie about excessive force claims, with about 56% of the 270 officers disciplined between January 2019 and August 2020 lying or giving inaccurate information on forms or to investigators, according to an analysis of records recently made public. A corrections department captain was charged with criminally negligent homicide after she allegedly let a prisoner hang himself and told other inmates the prisoner was just playing. Captain Rebecca Hillman told an officer to keep Ryan Wilson hanging in his cell, claiming Wilson was faking. Hillman pled not guilty. There was a 75% increase in police opting for early retirement last year, totaling 5,300 cops. The police are looking for a man that attacked a 61-year-old Chinese-American man in East Harlem who was seen in surveillance videos collecting cans before the suspect kicked him repeatedly in the head. Prosecutors from the Southern District U.S. Attorney's Office have charged Obama's former education policy advisor Seth Andrew with wire fraud, money laundering, and making false statements to a financial institution tied to stealing money from the democracy prep charter schools Andrew helped find in order to get a favorable interest rate for his mortgage. Shockwaves are sent through Queens after 32-year-old Jessica Bovis drove drunk and killed 14-year veteran police officer Anastasios Takos when she drove into him on the Long Island Expressway at 2 a.m. Bovis fled from the scene before being pulled over a mile away. After scaring everyone with their robot dog and politicians decried it, the NYPD decided after all that they screwed the pooch and are now getting rid of the Boston Dynamics four-legged creation, saving the NYPD $94,000. The rental website StreetEasy released a report last week finding that city rents hit record lows in the first 3 months of 2021 as tenants packed up and left for more rural environments to get away from the pandemic, and landlords can't get anyone to take up those apartments. The dearth of tenants also gave those that stuck around more bargaining power, lowering the median rent in Manhattan, for instance, to $2,700 a month. Queens official soccer team Queensboro FC pledged to construct a 7,500-seat stadium on the York College campus in Jamaica, Queens. The e-moped company Lime is launching a moped rideshare system in Queens, Brooklyn, and Lower Manhattan, making 100 mopeds in total available to see how the business model would work out, opening more commuting options to New Yorkers. Over at the City Council, not even a week after it was publicized that South Brooklyn Councilman Chaim Deutsch pled guilty to tax fraud, Council Speaker Johnson announced the expulsion of Deutsch from the council for betraying the public trust. Deutsch released a statement saying he was reviewing his legal option. Deutsch's ouster leaves the neighborhoods of Sheepshead Bay and parts of Brighton Beach without representation in the council. The council took up a bill this week that would have delivered aid to delivery workers in the form of letting them use restrooms in restaurants they're picking up food from, but also limiting the neighborhoods where they'll deliver. City Council members urged this week for the mayor to increase the amount of bus lanes by 30 miles by the end of the year, with members like Chair of the Transportation Committee Adonis Rodriguez asking for de Blasio to double that already 16 miles of bus lanes put down in 2020. Councilwoman Carlina Rivera introduced the bill she co-sponsored this week in the City Council, which would formally extend the Open Streets program started under Mayor de Blasio, which closed off roads in favor of pedestrian plazas. Business and community groups can ask the city under the new law to carve out more pedestrian zones, with a newly created cleanup corps helping to operate roads in the program. The bill was passed this week. Over at the Cuomo administration, more COVID restrictions were lifted this week throughout the state. Offices can now expand their capacities from 50 to 75% starting May 15th, and the state fair that happens annually in Syracuse but was canceled last year can now come back this summer. Casinos and gyms can now also expand their capacities to 50%. Outdoor events can increase to 33% from 25% starting May 19th. Anyone in the state 16 and up can now just walk into a state-run vaccination center without an appointment so they can get their shot, Cuomo announced this week. The same policy was put in place in the city. The governor also rescinded restaurant curfew starting May 17th, which in the beginning started with 11 p.m., then pushed to midnight. Curfew set up against catered events for 1 a.m. will be lifted at the end of the month. City restaurants can expand their capacity to 75% starting May 7th. In response to de Blasio's announcement that New York City will reopen fully by July 1st, the governor still staked the superiority of the city, saying that if it were truly that easy, he would open the city next week. Carly Bigi, the CEO of fashion company Laws of Motion, sued Cuomo in New York State for allegedly not paying her $10.4 million in exchange for delivering PPE at the height of the pandemic. The state had in fact filed a complaint against the fashion company with the FDA, saying the company's PPE was not actually suitable for medical purposes. Cuomo again said this week that the scandals surrounding his office were untrue, particularly the ones accusing him of sexual assault. Referencing the Attorney General's investigation, Cuomo said the report can't say anything different because I didn't do anything wrong. Cuomo also complained about how unfair it was that he couldn't give his side of the story, saying that he was trying to respect the process while those with political bias are trying to take him down.
Did you do the things you were accused of?
No.
If Tish James's report comes back and finds the contrary, considering that you've said zero tolerance for sexual harassment in this state, will you discipline yourself or consider resigning?
Yeah, the report can't say anything different because I didn't do anything wrong.
The Joint Commission on Public Ethics is said to have strengthened its ability to investigate how public officials get their outside income after criticism came down on the agency for how it seemingly gave Cuomo a pass after the governor published his COVID leadership book. JCOPE also announced their new executive director, Sanford Berland, a former justice of the Court of Claims in the Long Island Supreme Court, the trial-level court in that jurisdiction. One of the biggest criticisms of JCOPE is that it keeps hiring people from Cuomo's orbit, allowing him to escape the scrutiny of the agency meant to investigate public officials, but Berland is one of the first non-Cuomo staffers in a while. The New York Times published a report that claims Cuomo's obstruction of New York's true COVID numbers went deeper than before, saying that Cuomo's staff countermanded health officials for 5 months, including preventing Health Commissioner Howard Zucker from publicly releasing the true nursing home death toll, preventing the publishing of a scientific paper laying out the nursing home death data, and an audit of the numbers was finished way earlier than was known before. In the meantime, the governor kept marketing his new COVID leadership book, playing up his stewardship of the pandemic in New York. Cuomo responded to the report by saying that delays of numbers being released to lawmakers is tied to skepticism about the accuracy of nursing home death data at the time. Republican New York Congressman Lee Zeldin, who had announced his candidacy to become the Republican nominee for governor against presumably Cuomo, is halfway to officially becoming the Conservative Party's nominee on New York's ballot. New York Republicans plan on choosing one candidate to back by June. State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli criticized the adopted state budget this week, saying there were missed opportunities to lower borrowing money and improve the state's long-term financial picture. The Brooklyn U.S. Attorney's Office is looking to subpoena Hardwire LLC, a contractor that allegedly messed up cable shields on the Kosciuszko Bridge, which are now falling apart. Hardwire sued a former employee who is being blamed for the botched construction for the cables and who Hardwire is trying to win $40 million from. The Long Island Power Authority is thinking about other utilities to replace the Public Service Enterprise Group, or PSEG, which currently manages Long Island's electric grid, according to LIPA Chief Tom Falcone, who said that he's thinking of splitting management of the grid to two utility companies. The move came after Tropical Storm Isaias removed power from 645,000 customers, putting all of that anger on the PSEG's mismanagement of the aftermath. Over at the state legislature, a bill introduced by Senator Brian Benjamin this week sought to ban fired officers or cops who resigned from their departments because of misconduct allegations from working in law enforcement in New York. Current state laws have loopholes that would allow officers who were fired or resigned because of misconduct to work in other departments throughout the country. Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins again called for Cuomo to resign this week after appearing alongside the governor last week for an event and not saying anything, facing accusations that calls for the governor to step down or abating the longer he sticks around. State Republican lawmakers are saying that nothing of substance has been done to roll back Cuomo's COVID powers, even after the governor signed a bill repealing them. Republicans like Dutchess County Republican Sue Serino say it was a false rollback, pointing to Cuomo's extension of a curfew on restaurants and bars as evidence the governor continues to do what he wants. The law the legislature wrote and Cuomo passed takes back Cuomo's powers and prevents him from making up new regulations, but Cuomo can still amend existing orders he passed. The Senate Democratic majority did go ahead and suspend numerous executive orders that Cuomo put in place back when he had unchecked executive powers, including getting rid of the requirement that restaurants serve food with alcohol, which was put in place to stop people from congregating without masks in front of restaurants when they were closed. Rescinded also was the waiver letting volunteers work for the state's efforts to respond to the pandemic, which sent Cuomo's COVID coordinator Larry Schwartz, who was at the center of a brief scandal wherein county leaders accused Schwartz of asking about their support for the governor in the midst of the vaccine rollout, out the door. A third rescission dealt with outdated restrictions. State Senator James Skoufis sent out document requests to Tappan Zee Constructors LLC, the contractors that built the Mario Cuomo Bridge, amidst concerns the contractor messed up the bolt on the bridge after a whistleblower claimed supervisors knew about the botched construction and kept things quiet. The state Senate passed a bill trying to increase the water quality throughout the state, which includes testing for lead in parks, banning pesticide at summer camps, and a ban on coal tar. Over at the state judiciary, criticism has come down on New York Court of Appeals Chief Judge Janet DeFiore for not recusing herself from a case being argued by DeFiore's own legal counsel, Henry Greenberg, from the powerful law firm Greenberg Traurig, who represented DeFiore in two of her own cases, including one about old judges being excluded from the judiciary at the height of the pandemic. Opposing counsel in the cases where Greenberg and his lawyers argued before the court said that if they knew about Greenberg's representation of DeFiore, they would have requested DeFiore's recusal due to the potential conflicts of interest. Court of Appeals spokesman Gary Spencer said that judges don't give personal disclosures of conflicts and don't discuss recusals. The Commission on Judicial Nomination released their list of replacements for the late Court of Appeals Judge Paul Feinman, who stepped down suddenly due to health concerns before subsequently passing away. The list includes prominent lawyers and law professors. Albany County Judge William Carter, who has a history of ethical lapses, resigned this week after the State Commission on Judicial Conduct looked into the judge's attempts to get an approved gun permit for a friend. Carter's lawyer called the commission a kangaroo court in its effort to investigate the issue. Long Island's Manor Haven Village Court Justice Peter Gallanter also resigned after being investigated by the State Commission on Judicial Conduct for favoritism and sexism. Gallanter agreed to never take judicial office in the future. Arcadia Town Court and Newark Village Court Justice Michael Ralph Miller also resigned from the bench after he was sentenced to 3 years probation last month for stalking his ex-girlfriend. Miller pled guilty to a misdemeanor second-degree criminal contempt charge. You may recall the case of late former rich guy Jeffrey Epstein, his rape of minor teenage girls, and his friend Ghislaine Maxwell, who was complicit in the whole thing. Epstein apparently killed himself while he was awaiting trial. Maxwell pleaded not guilty this week to her child sex trafficking charges in Manhattan federal court. A First Department Appellate Division ruling said that the music producer Dr. Luke is not a public figure, striking a blow on music artist Kesha's appeal against Dr. Luke's defamation case against her, stemming from allegations of rape Kesha made against Dr. Luke. If Dr. Luke was considered a public figure, Kesha would have had to known for a fact that the rape allegation was false, heightening the bar for Dr. Luke's defamation case against her. The First Department Appellate Division came out with a ruling this week taking away the law license of former Attorney General Eric Schneiderman for 1 year after Schneiderman resigned due to his sexual assault allegations. Schneiderman was seen as a rising star in the Democratic Party before he was accused of abusive behavior in past relationships. The Appellate Division said that mitigating factors prevented a harsher penalty. New York City sued Chipotle this week for owing its workers $150 million in Fair Work Week law violations that included changing worker schedules without notice or pay, making workers work shifts back-to-back without more pay, or providing more shifts to existing employees before hiring new workers. State Justice Emilio Kolikovo denied a request for a preliminary injunction from Williamsville and Orchard Park parents that would have forced schools in those upstate areas to start in-person learning and ordered a hearing on May 7th for the parents' lawyers to argue for their position. You may have heard of protesters suing cops for heavy-handed protest tactics, but how about an Asian cop suing racist protesters? NYPD Detective Vincent Chung sued Terrell Harper, who hurled racist comments at Detective Chung during last summer's BLM protests. Chung said that he suffered emotional distress as a result of the episode, while Harper acknowledged his comments and apologized. The lawsuit does present an opportunity for police to go after the free speech rights of protesters, which concern civil rights activists. Over at the Biden administration, Biden finished up his first 100 days, ending the informal trial period by which the public gauges the new president's successes and failures. Reporters highlighted Biden's COVID relief and vaccination successes, along with his introduction of the American Jobs Plan, Biden's attempt at an infrastructure bill, which would inject massive investment into the American economy, while Biden's failures included his handling of the immigration crisis at the southern border, with difficulty handling a surge of unaccompanied migrant children, along with hesitancy to walk away from Trump's more controversial immigration restrictions. Public polling released falls along those concerns as well, with Biden's 53% approval rating kept lower with his handling of gun reforms as well, as an increase of gun violence corresponded with the nation's pandemic recovery. Politico released their own approval survey for the president, having Biden come out with an overall 58% approval rating. The president addressed Congress for the first time since he was elected, with a delay owing to the pandemic, when presidents usually address Congress for the first time in February. One of the major initiatives Biden introduced was his American Family Plan, which includes launching a 10-week summer food program that would offer parents of 30 million low-income kids with $375 per child, which would make it the biggest summer food program in history. The plan also includes other measures such as extending the child tax credit, subsidizing child care, starting a national paid family and medical leave program, free universal preschool, reducing Obamacare premiums, free community college, and increasing Pell Grants for college students. The entire initiative will cost $1.8 trillion, with the president asking Congress to foot the entire bill. Biden also called on Congress to pass his infrastructure plan and more police accountability measures.
Now, after just 100 days, I can report to the nation, America is on the move again. There's still more work to do to beat this virus. We can't let our guard down. But tonight, I can say, because of you, the American people, our progress these past 100 days against one of the worst pandemics in history has been one of the greatest logistical achievements this country's ever seen. The American Jobs Plan will help millions of people get back to their jobs and back to their careers. 12 years is no longer enough today to compete with the rest of the world in the 21st century. That's why my American Families Plan guarantees 4 additional years of public education for every person in America, starting as early as we can. The American Families Plan will finally provide up to 12 weeks of paid leave and medical leave, family medical leave. No one should have to choose between a job and a paycheck or taking care of themselves and their loved ones or parent or spouse or child. How do we pay for my jobs and family plan? I made it clear we can do it without increasing the deficits. Let's start with what I will not do. I will not impose any tax increase on people making less than $400,000. But it's time for corporate America and the wealthiest 1% of Americans to just begin to pay their fair share. In addition to my family's plan, I'm going to work with Congress to address this year other critical priorities for American families. To all transgender Americans watching at home, especially young people, you're so brave. I want you to know your president has your back. We have to come together to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people they serve, to root out systemic racism in our criminal justice system, and to enact police reform in George Floyd's name. The country supports this reform, and Congress should act. We have a giant opportunity to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice, real justice. And I'll do everything in my power to protect the American people from this epidemic of gun violence. But it's time for Congress to act as well. We need more Senate Republicans to join the overwhelming majority of Democratic colleagues and close the loopholes required in background check purchases of guns. The soul of America, we need to protect the sacred right to vote. Instead, it's being attacked. Congress should pass H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and send it to my desk right away. The country supports it, and Congress should act now.
Republican South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, one of the few black GOP members of Congress, gave the official Republican rebuttal to Biden's speech, clutching at Biden's plans as a scheme to tax Americans more and more, but also claiming that America is not a racist country despite invoking personal episodes of being arbitrarily pulled over by police and followed around stores.
Good evening. I'm Senator Tim Scott from the great state of South Carolina. We just heard President Biden's first address to Congress. Our president seems like a good man. His speech was full of good words, but President Biden promised you a specific kind of leadership. He promised to unite a nation, to lower the temperature, to govern for all Americans, no matter how we voted. This was the pitch. You just heard it again. But our nation is starving for more than empty platitudes. We need policies and progress that brings us closer together. But 3 months in, the actions of the president and his party are pulling us further and further apart. 100 years ago, kids in classrooms were taught the color of their skin was their most important characteristic. And if they looked a certain way, they were inferior. Today, kids are being taught that the color of their skin defines them again. And if they look a certain way, they're an oppressor. From colleges to corporations to our culture, people are making money and gaining power by pretending we haven't made any progress at all, by doubling down on the divisions we've worked so hard to heal. You know this stuff is wrong. Hear me clearly. America is not a racist country. It's backwards to fight discrimination with different types of discrimination, and it's wrong to try to use our painful past to dishonestly shut down debates in the present. I'm an African American who's voted in the South my entire life. I take voting rights personally. Republicans support making it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and so do the voters. It will be easier to vote early in Georgia than in Democrat-run New York. But the left doesn't want you to know that. They want people virtue signaling by yelling about a law they haven't even read. Fact checkers have called out the White House for misstatements. The president absurdly claims that this is worse than Jim Crow. What is going on here? I'll tell you, a Washington power grab.
Despite the government unpausing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine with a new warning label slapped on, surveys report that people are really hesitant to take the vaccine ever again, sticking to the 2-dose Pfizer and Moderna vaccines instead. You may recall J&J's one-shot vaccine was paused due to rare blood clotting cases in women between 18 to 40 years old, with 3 women having died due to the rare condition. To put the rarity of the condition into context, with less than 10 people who suffered blood clotting, there are almost 8 million people who were vaccinated with a shot who didn't have these issues. Biden also said there's new guidance on wearing masks outside, updating the federal government's recommendation on mask wearing to lift the need for people to wear masks around each other at all times if people aren't densely packed together. However, even vaccinated people have to keep wearing masks if they find themselves in crowded areas. The CDC said that 5 million people in the U.S. haven't gotten their second shots when they were supposed to, comprising 8% of the 140 million Americans that got at least one dose. The CDC said that cruises can restart in July depending on where the cruise companies are in complying with the CDC's guidelines, and the TSA said that it was extending a mask mandate on airplanes until September. Studies show that ventilation on airplanes make it a bit safer against infection, but masks are still encouraged. Biden barely mentioned immigration in his address to Congress this week, but in an interview with the Today Show, he blamed the Trump administration for the current crisis for not giving Biden's transition team, quote, full access to virtually anything concerning the Defense Department and immigration, which to his discovery were understaffed in relevant departments due to Trump firing everyone. The DHS is reportedly in talks to get Mexico to identify which migrants can receive humanitarian exceptions to the current rule that allows the U.S. to send people back across the border using the pandemic as an excuse. Biden signed an executive order this week raising the minimum wage for federal contractors to $15 an hour, up from $10.95. An effort to raise the national minimum wage to $15 an hour failed in the Senate after the Senate parliamentarian ruled the measure couldn't be put into the COVID relief bill. Biden also wants to propose giving the IRS an additional $80 billion for its budget to go after tax evasion perpetrated by the wealthy and large corporations. The U.S. economy grew 1.6% in the first 3 months of 2020 at an annual rate of 6.4%, according to the Treasury Department. The final quarter of 2020 saw a growth of 1.1%, with economists saying the U.S. is on its way back to pre-pandemic levels. Jobless claims are also lower, with 553,000 claims being filed last week, 13,000 lower than the week before. Labor Secretary Marty Walsh came out this week endorsing the efforts of gig workers like Uber and Lyft drivers and delivery workers to get full benefits and legal protections other full-time workers get. Uber and other companies are against the effort, saying that their workers are independent contractors who are supposed to be only working part-time. But the gig economy has proved to be a more lucrative venture for some workers without enjoying the benefits of health insurance and other interests. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced this week that the Justice Department is launching an investigation into how Louisville, Kentucky police handled Breonna Taylor's death, who was shot in her bed as police served a no-knock warrant based on outdated information on Taylor's apartment, which was a suspected meeting spot for drug deals. Breonna died after a gunfight erupted between police and Taylor's boyfriend, who said he believed someone was breaking into the apartment. The Justice Department also officially rescinded a Trump policy that held back federal funds from so-called sanctuary cities or jurisdictions that defunded their police departments and or refused to cooperate with immigration authorities. 3 men involved in shooting and killing Ahmaud Arbery, a black man jogging in his own neighborhood in Georgia in February 2020, were charged and indicted for Arbery's murder. The Justice Department charged Travis McMichael, his father Gregory, and William Bryan with hate crimes and attempted kidnapping, with Travis also charged with shooting Arbery. The FBI raided former New York City Mayor and Trump personal attorney Rudy Giuliani's New York City apartment and business, seizing Giuliani's electronic devices and escalating a criminal investigation looking into Giuliani's alleged illegal lobbying on behalf of Ukraine, when Giuliani sought the country's help to dig dirt on Biden when Biden was just a Democratic challenger in the presidential primaries. The FBI had reportedly warned Giuliani, Senator Ron Johnson, and the Trump administration in late 2019 that a Russian disinformation campaign targeted Giuliani, including the conservative news network One American News, as conduits to influence the 2020 presidential election. Rudy went on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News to deny the charges against him, saying that he, quote, never ever represented a foreign national, end quote. It said that in his contracts with clients, he expressly rejected lobbying. At the heart of the probe is Giuliani's efforts to get former Ukrainian ambassador Marie Yovanovitch fired, which he was by former President Trump. The Biden administration said that it was setting the refugee cap to 62,500 again, a month after walking back the idea, much to the dismay of activists and Democratic colleagues. It quickly got the president to change his mind. Biden reportedly plans to nominate Mark Gittenstein as the U.S. ambassador to the UK and Julie Smith to NATO, with an announcement before leaving for his June overseas trip. The president also officially nominated Ed Gonzalez, a Houston, Texas sheriff who was vocally against Trump's administration and was known for cutting contracts with ICE that would have required Gonzalez's department to notify ICE whenever they picked up an undocumented immigrant to actually lead the agency. Frank Kendall was nominated by the administration to become the next Air Force Secretary, and Gino Ortiz as the Air Force Undersecretary. The administration announced the second round of judicial picks to be nominated to federal courts, continuing the trend of diverse recommendations. The EPA is going ahead with permitting California to establish its own mileage standards to combat climate change, with the Transportation Department withdrawing federal restrictions on emissions rules. The CDC released a study finding that unsafe bedding causes 3 out of 4 sudden infant deaths, saying that items such as blankets and stuffed animals cause accidental suffocation among infants 4 months and younger. The Biden administration also officially lifted restrictions on prescribing the addiction treatment drug buprenorphine, or Suboxone under its branded name, according to new guidance. The Trump administration stopped short of doing the same thing in its final days, but only would have lifted the guidance for doctors, while Biden's guidance applies also to other health workers like nurse practitioners, physician assistants, midwives, and more. The FDA announced that it was moving forward with banning menthol cigarettes, pointing to false advertising marketed towards the black community, as 85% of African Americans smoke menthol cigarettes. The agency had to make a decision ahead of an April 29th court order. Certain civil rights groups actually opposed the ban on menthol cigarettes, including the ACLU, which say that a black market would just be started with the ban, which consequently invites more policing on the black community, with the ACLU invoking the example of Eric Garner, who was allegedly selling loose cigarettes before he was choked to death by former police officer Daniel Pantaleo. The Defense Department and other federal agencies are investigating at least 2 invisible directed energy attacks, one of which was near the White House last November, which are similar to incidents that affected overseas diplomats in Cuba, Russia, and China that caused headaches, dizziness, nausea, and ear popping, altogether called Havana syndrome. While it's still not clear what's causing the syndrome, suspicions fall on them being directed attacks. Biden announced that the U.S. is going to send 60 million AstraZeneca vaccines to India, along with other PPE and hospital supplies to help combat India's massive resurgence of COVID infections and death. India apparently let its guard down after calming down the pandemic in its country, with more than 350,000 cases popping up daily on the heels of massive festivals and elections, cramming people together in tight spaces. The State Department urged any Americans in India to leave as the case count continued to climb. The Biden administration later in the week announced a travel moratorium against India, citing the bursting COVID numbers in the country. The spokesman for Turkey's president said that the country will respond to Biden's official recognition of the Armenian genocide, quote, in due time. Armenia, on the other hand, commended Biden for his pronouncement, saying it makes the world a better place. Republicans are calling for Biden to get rid of climate envoy John Kerry for apparently giving away classified details of Israel's operations against Iran, even though the information was common sense to everybody but Iran's foreign minister Javad Zarif, who was the only surprised one, according to the State Department. Kerry himself rejected the claim that he was discussing secret Israeli operations with the Iranian foreign minister. Talks about bringing Iran and the U.S. back to the negotiating table for the nuclear deal restarted in Vienna this week. What can affect those talks is the fact that a Navy ship had to fire warning shots against Iranian vessels after the Iranian ships got too close to 2 Coast Guard boats, an escalation that hasn't been seen in 4 years. Meanwhile, John Kerry disclosed millions of dollars in income due to his involvement in finance and energy firms Bank of America, Deutsch Bank, Waste Management, and Cornell University, receiving money partly from drawing salaries and partly from speaking engagements. Kerry, according to disclosure forms, has signed an ethics pledge and divested his interest in those companies that would cause a conflict of interest. The top military official in Afghanistan, General Austin Miller, said that troops have already begun closing operations and are getting ready to withdraw starting May 1st, and also said that it doesn't make sense to restart negotiations with the Taliban, the extremist Islamist group that ruled over the country before the U.S. invaded, even though U.S. negotiator Sher Mohammad Abbas Stanagzai said that he reached a breakthrough with them. The U.S. officially began pulling out of Afghanistan this week with embassy staff told to go home. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the bloc would allow vaccinated Americans to visit EU countries this summer, changing their prior position from closing down all non-essential travel since the pandemic began. The EU plans on using certificates as a way to prove someone got vaccinated. That proposed summit between Biden and Putin might actually happen. Administration sources told CNN that details for the summit are being hammered out between the U.S. and Russia. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is planning on visiting Ukraine next month, and Ukrainian officials are being read into the plans as well. Vice President Kamala Harris spoke to community organizations from Guatemala at a virtual roundtable discussion to identify ways to stem the flow of migrants showing up at the southern border. A recently announced $310 million was pledged to Guatemala as humanitarian aid in order to mitigate the amount of migrants coming out of there and the region. A Morning Consult poll found that the U.S.'s standing in the world increased by 9 points across 14 countries that were asked, including Germany, where the U.S. looked better by 22 points since Biden took office. However, China looks more down upon the U.S., with Chinese survey respondents looking at the U.S. unfavorably by 74%. Over in Congress, Brendan Hunt, a Trump supporter who made death threats against Congress members in a video after the January 6th insurrection, was convicted of making a threat to assault and murder a U.S. official, which is a possible 10-year prison sentence. Hunt was a former court employee. Over at the House, the Constitutional Population Counting Census that happens every 10 years released its results this week, showing that New York had an increased population of about 4%, but decreases in the population in certain districts of about 89 people resulted in a 1-seat loss in the state's number of congressional seats. The census was controversial this time around because of Trump's attempts to include questions weeding out undocumented immigrants, as well as then Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross's efforts to delay carrying out the census. The result had to be delayed anyway because of the pandemic. California had a seat loss for the first time in history, while Texas gained 2 seats of its own. New York's Governor Cuomo even reserved the right to sue the federal government, saying that a state seat loss could have been a result of mistakes by the feds. House Republicans held a retreat this past week in Florida, making a couple of headlines with interviews from Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who, despite being confident his party will reclaim the House in the upcoming midterm elections, was constantly dodging questions about his conversations with former President Trump in the midst of the January 6th insurrection, and said House Speaker Pelosi was only interested in politics for not including Black Lives Matter protests in the proposed commission to investigate the insurrection. Meanwhile, Representative Liz Cheney, one of the Republicans who voted to impeach Trump, said that Republicans that supported blocking Biden's certification and provided tacit support for the insurrection shouldn't be members of Congress anymore and doesn't support Trump's re-election in 2024, and broke with McCarthy by saying the Insurrection Commission should only look into what happened on January 6th. Republican Representative Matt Gaetz' nightmare isn't over. After the Florida Republican became the subject of a child sex trafficking probe by the FBI, owing in part to the cooperation deal Gaetz' friend, former Florida Seminole County tax collector Joe Greenberg, has with the FBI. The Daily Beast reported this week pictures of a letter that Greenberg wrote to Trump ally Roger Stone, who admitted to paying 17-year-old girls for sex with Gaetz, and Roger Stone soliciting $250,000 in Bitcoin from Greenberg for a pardon from former President Trump at the time. Democratic Representative from Illinois, Cherry Bustos, announced that she won't be seeking re-election next year, staking her retirement, saying she feels like it's time for a new voice in her stead. Over in the Senate, Senator Manchin continues his influence over Biden's infrastructure plan owing to his political power in a 50-50 Senate. The West Virginia moderate Democrat called for a smaller infrastructure bill, which, after saying he wants the proposed corporate tax rate to be 25%, not 28%, now Manchin says he wants the bill to be cut up into separate plans. If anyone wanted to know how Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell felt about Biden's first 100 days, he said that the president's first few months being in office was a massive disappointment because he apparently broke his promise of bipartisanship. Republicans are salty over Biden pushing through a COVID relief bill without Republican support after the GOP gave a small starting number for an aid bill and had him move from their negotiating position. Senate Democrats pulled a procedural move from the Congressional Review Act this week to put back controls on methane emissions, which were taken off by the Trump administration. The Senate voted to reinstate methane controls 52-42, with Democrats flipping the script on Republicans who used the CRA numerously against Obama. The new regulation controlling how much methane can leak out of oil and gas wells now goes to the House, where it's expected to pass. The Senate confirmed former Obama UN Ambassador Samantha Power to the post of head of the U.S. Agency for International Development by a vote of 68-26. Biden is also going to place Power in his National Security Council. Meanwhile, Biden's pick to become the Pentagon's next chief acquisitions officer is being investigated by the Defense Department Inspector General's office for allegedly going around government hiring rules when he also served as the head of the Pentagon Defense Innovation Unit. Over at the federal judiciary, the Supreme Court made a few waves in the news this week with cases it decided to take up, starting with one that deals with how far a school can go for a student's actions off campus. When Brandy Levy was 14, she sent her friends a Snapchat video flipping the screen off and dropping the F-bomb about everything, school, cheers, softball, and more, because she was kept on her school's JV cheer squad. Levy's school accordingly took her off the cheer squad completely, pointing to a policy that forbids foul language and inappropriate gestures. While court precedent says students don't leave their constitutional rights at the door, schools still have the authority to take disciplinary action over things students do on campus, but this case concerns what happens way off of it. The justices heard the case this week, figuring out how to balance free speech with letting schools police speech to prevent bullying and other damaging, disruptive behaviors. The court also ended up dismissing a challenge by Republican state attorneys general who were trying to force the Biden administration to keep Trump's public charge rule, which meant any immigrant that would rely on the state for welfare would have their immigration status denied. The White House rescinded the rule last month, not too long after a federal district judge placed a nationwide hold on the regulation, and the Supreme Court said the attorney generals can seek their relief through the district courts, in other words, from the bottom. But continuing our zigzag of high court stories, the court agreed to hear a case backed by the National Rifle Association reviewing a New York state law since 1913 placing restrictions on concealed carry gun permits. New York currently requires an applicant to have a reason beyond a special need for self-protection, quote, distinguishable from that of the general community or of persons engaged in the same profession, end quote. Those that need a gun to hunt or to protect their store can only use their gun for those purposes. Lower court rulings, including one from Hawaii, held up a state's regulation to place restrictions on concealed carry permits, but the court's conservative majority might see an expansion of concealed gun rights. The Supreme Court sided with a Guatemalan immigrant, Augusto Nis Chavez, in a 6-3 decision that said immigration agencies must give immigrants a single notice of their decision as opposed to multiple documents. Justice Gorsuch wrote the opinion, which emphasized the Square Corners Doctrine from 1920, which states someone has to be properly given notice by the government in order to have adequate due process, which in Nis Chavez's case would have been hard to do since he received several notices with different information on them. Justice Kavanaugh wrote for the dissent, saying the ruling went counter to common sense. SCOTUS decided to take on 2 other cases, one dealing with whether Abu Zubaydah, a detainee at Guantanamo Bay, can subpoena the CIA for information about the black site Zubaydah was detained in, and another case dealing with whether charities have to reveal the names of their donors in response to a California law that makes charities list their top donors to combat financial fraud. The court also rejected consideration of a lawsuit from Texas against California for the latter's ban on state government business trips to Texas because of the state's LGBTQ policies, which California deems discriminatory. The Second Circuit reversed the district court's ruling that allowed bar exam takers to sue the Board of Law Examiners for disability discrimination. The plaintiff, a Harvard Law graduate, sued the board examiners for allegedly not giving her reasonable accommodations, a requirement under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 for groups receiving federal funding like the examiners. However, the Second Circuit said that the board doesn't get federal funding, but rather funding from the courts. So thus, it's not the way the statute meant. Lastly, in national news, Looking at the type of people being hospitalized for COVID in Michigan reveals that most of the patients are people in the 30s and 40s, with the state recording 91,000 cases over the past 2 weeks. Following Johnson & Johnson's blood clot problem, leading to their pause then unpause with an updated safety notice slapped on, a new survey showed that only 22% of unvaccinated Americans would be willing to take it, with 73% pinning the rear safety concerns as a reason they wouldn't go for it. In West Virginia, Republican Governor Jim Justice has resorted to paying people $100 if they go and get vaccinated in an attempt to address those who are refusing to get their shot. Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla said that an oral pill that people can take at home and treat COVID can come out by the end of the year, working by inhibiting a necessary enzyme for the virus's survival. The company is also still testing its vaccine in 6-month to 11-year-old kids. North Carolina Sheriff Tommy Wooten announced that he was going to ask a judge to release the police body cam footage of the fatal encounter North Carolina officers had with Andrew Brown Jr., who was shot and killed by deputies in the back when they were serving warrants. The judge ended up delaying the release of the footage, saying that it wouldn't be in the public interest to release the video showing Brown's death, but allowing the family to watch the footage instead. An independent autopsy funded by Brown's family also concluded that Brown was killed from bullets shot at his back, including one to the back of his head, with the family saying that it shows Brown was running away from police. The FBI said that it's initiating an investigation into the shooting. In the meantime, 4 deputies that were involved in the Brown incident returned to active duty, while the 3 who were identified with Brown's shooting continue to be investigated. A Washington Post investigation found that nationwide attempts from civilian oversight groups to hold police accountable usually hits obstacles placed by the police unions themselves, including politicians that receive contributions from those unions. The report, although seemingly common knowledge in the age of renewed activism against police brutality, puts quantitative information on the topic. In Chicago, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability released police body cam footage of the death of Anthony Alvarez, who died at the hands of police during a chase. Alvarez allegedly had a gun in his hand, and the video doesn't show Alvarez pointing the weapon at the police while he was being chased. In California, protests sparked after the death of Mario Gonzalez, after an Alameda, California police officer pinned Gonzalez with a knee on his back. Body cam video shows Gonzalez gasping for breath before dying as the officer's knee remains on his back. Supporters of a recall election against California Governor Gavin Newsom have officially reached their required number of petition signatures, according to the state, having reached almost 1.5 million signatures. The recall campaign is being led by Republicans, who are hoping voters would agree to recall Newsom after pandemic fatigue and early examples of Newsom ignoring his own COVID regulations. Despite those concerns, a poll released by the Public Policy Institute of California showed that 59% of likely voters in the state approve Newsom's management of school reopenings and 59% approve of his handling of the state's jobs and the economy. Continuing the trend of Republican legislatures passing voting bills that curtail easy access to voting, the Florida legislature this week passed a bill that added more requirements to mail-in voting and restricts the use of ballot drop boxes. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said that he was going to, of course, sign the bill into law. One of the 3 men who landed on the moon for the first time, Michael Collins, died this week at the age of 90. Collins piloted Apollo 11, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin got to take humanity's first steps on the moon for the whole world to see. Aldrin is now the last surviving crew member of that famous trip from 1969. And that's it for this week's show of the 25th Hour, helping you stay on top of the 24/7 news cycle. Don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts, share us with your friends, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us your tips and suggestions at the 25thhournews@gmail.com and become a patron today for as low as $2 a month to support the show at patreon.com/the25thhournews. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.